The 8th United States Army is an American field army which is the commanding formation of all United States Army forces in South Korea, a task force of troops which are composed of personnel from the American-South Korean alliance. It is based at the Yongsan Army Garrison, located in the Yongsan district of Seoul, South Korea. History. World War II. The unit first activated on 10 June 1944 in the United States, being commanded by Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger. The 8th Army took part in many of the amphibious landings in the Southwest Pacific theater of World War II, eventually participating in no less than 60 of them. The first mission of the 8th Army, in September 1944, was to take over from the U.S. 6th Army in New Guinea, New Britain, the Admiralty Islands and on Morotai, in order to free up the 6th Army to engage in the Philippines campaign. The 8th Army again followed in the wake of the 6th Army in December, when it took over control of operations on Leyte Island on 26 December. In January, the 8th Army entered combat on Luzon, landing the 11th Corps on 29 January near San Antonio and the 11th Airborne Division on the other side of Manila Bay 2 days later. Combining with 1st Corps and 14th Corps of 6th Army, the forces of 8th Army next enveloped Manila in a great double pincer movement. 8th Army's final operation of the Pacific War was that of clearing out the southern Philippines of the Japanese Army, including on the major island of Mindanao, an effort that occupied the soldiers of the 8th Army for the rest of the war. Occupation of Japan. 8th Army was to have participated in Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. It would have taken part in Operation Coronet, the second phase of the invasion, which would have seen the invasion of the Kanto Plain on eastern Honshu. However, instead of invading Japan, 8th Army found itself in charge of occupying it peacefully. Occupation forces landed on 30 August 1945, with its headquarters in Yokohama. Then the HQ moved to the Daiichi Building in Tokyo. At the beginning of 1946, 8th Army assumed responsibility for occupying all of Japan. 4 quiet years then followed, during which the 8th Army gradually deteriorated from a combat-ready fighting force into a somewhat soft, minimally trained constabulary. Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker took command in 1948, and he tried to reinvigorate the Army's training, but he was largely unsuccessful. This situation was to have serious consequences in South Korea. Korean War. The peace of occupied Japan was shattered in June 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea, igniting the Korean War. American naval and air forces quickly became involved in combat operations, and it was soon clear that American ground forces would have to be committed to stem the North Korean advance. The occupation forces in Japan were thus shipped off to South Korea as quickly as possible. But their lack of training and equipment was telling, as some of the initial American units were destroyed by the North Koreans. However, the stage was eventually reached as enough units of 8th Army arrived in Korea to make a firm front. The North Koreans threw themselves against that front, the Pusan perimeter, and failed to break it. In the meantime, 8th Army had reorganized, since it had too many divisions under its command for it to exercise effective control directly. The 1st Corps and the 9th Corps were reactivated in the United States and then shipped to Korea to assume command of 8th Army's subordinate divisions. The stalemate was broken by the Incheon landings of the 10th Corps. The North Korean forces, when confronted with this threat to their rear areas, combined with the breakout operation at Pusan, broke away and hastily retired. Both South and North Korea were almost entirely occupied by United Nations forces. However, once American units neared the Yalu River and the frontier between North Korea and China, the Chinese intervened and drastically changed the character of the war. 8th Army was decisively defeated at the Battle of the Chongchon River and forced to retreat all the way back to South Korea. American historian Clay Blair noted that the Eighth Army was left completely unprotected on its right flank due to the Turkish brigade's retreat. Despite myths that arose about the Turks killing 200 enemies by bayonet, the defeat of the U.S. Eighth Army resulted in the longest retreat of any American military unit in history. General Walker was killed in a Jeep accident and replaced by Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway. The overstretched Eighth Army suffered heavily with the Chinese offensive, who were able to benefit from shorter lines of communication and with rather casually deployed enemy forces. The Chinese broke through the American defenses despite American air supremacy, and the Eighth Army and UN forces retreated hastily to avoid encirclement. The Chinese offensive continued pressing American forces, which lost Seoul, the South Korean capital. Eighth Army's morale and esprit de corps hit rock bottom, to where it was widely regarded as a broken, defeated rabble. General Ridgway forcefully restored Eighth Army to combat effectiveness over several months. Under his leadership, it slowed and finally halted the Chinese advance at the battles of Chipyong and Wanj. It then counter-attacked the Chinese, taking Seoul again, and driving the Communist forces back above the 38th parallel into North Korea. Next, the front stabilized in the 38th parallel area, when General Ridgway replaced General of the Army Douglas MacArthur as the overall UN commander. Lieutenant General James Van Fleet assumed command of Eighth Army. After the War of Movement during the first stages, the fighting in Korea settled down to a war of attrition. Ceasefire negotiations were begun at the village of Panmunjom in the summer of 1951, and they dragged on for 2 years. When the military demarcation line was finally agreed to by the Korean Armistice Agreement, the Eighth Army had failed in its mission of capturing the Korean peninsula. But the realities of a limited war in a world of nuclear weapons had become obvious. South Korea and North Korea continued on as separate states. Post-Korean War. During the aftermath of the Korean War, the Eighth Army remained in South Korea, but the forces under its command were continually reduced as the demands of the U.S. Army in Europe and then the Vietnam War increased. By the 1960s, only the 1st Corps, consisting of the 7th Infantry Division and the 2nd Infantry Division, remained as part of the 8th Army. Then, in 1971, further reductions occurred. The 7th Infantry Division was withdrawn from South Korea, along with the command units of 1st Corps, which were moved across the Pacific Ocean to Fort Lewis, Washington. Later, in January 1977, President Carter launched a review intended to withdraw all forces from South Korea. A March 1977 memo from Carter said that, American forces will be withdrawn, air cover will be continued, incessant bureaucratic resistance from within the executive branch, with supporting Congress, eventually saw the proposal watered down effectively to nothing. Finally, only one combat battalion and about 2,600 non-combat troops were withdrawn. This left only the 2nd Infantry Division to watch the Korean demilitarized zone and to assist the South Korean Army in defending their country, besides forming a tripwire against another North Korean invasion. The 2nd Infantry Division remained there as the only army unit in South Korea armed with tactical nuclear weapons. All nuclear weapons were taken from the Army to be under Air Force control. Later, all U.S. nuclear weapons were removed from South Korea. In 2003, plans were announced to move almost all of the 2nd Infantry Division southwards, away from the border. That would in turn reduce the tripwire effect of having the 2ID close to the DMZ. This provoked a heated debate in South Korea, where the future of the 8th Army is still a contentious topic. As of 2015, it appears that one brigade of the 2nd Infantry Division will remain at Camp Casey, near the city of Dongducheon. The headquarters of the 8th Army is located at Yongsan Garrison, but it is scheduled to move southward to Camp Humphreys by 2019. Current structure: Command Group Commanding General, Lieutenant General Bernard S. Champu. Command Sergeant Major, Command Sergeant Major Rick Merritt. Current structure: 8th Army, Yongsan Garrison 2nd Infantry Division, Camp Red Cloud 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team, Camp Hovey, deactivated in July 2015. 210th Field Artillery Brigade, Camp Casey Combat Aviation Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division USAG Humphreys. 19th Sustainment Command, Daig 501st Sustainment Brigade, Camp Carroll Army Material Support Center, Camp Carroll. 35th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, Osan Air Base. 501st Military Intelligence Brigade, Yongsan Garrison. 1st Signal Brigade, Yongsan Garrison. 65th Medical Brigade, Yongsan Garrison. Headquarters and Headquarters Battalion, Yongsan Garrison Headquarters and Headquarters Company Headquarters and Headquarters Detachment United Nations Command Honor Guard Company. Korean Service Corps Battalion, Camp Kim, UN. Command Security Battalion, Joint Security Area. List of commanders.